Okay, well, Lawrence Walmsley, I'm the events chair of the Club of South Florida. We had a what was it, the annual dinner in May with an architectural theme, and some other topics came out about how, we should actually, there's so many aspects of Miami that are quite interesting and dynamic, and they didn't just happen, right? There's an element of urban planning and a structure, and with Liz and Andres, we put this idea together that maybe we can have a discussion about what has changed over the past several decades and why it's changed, and what could happen going forward. And so I have a kind of a sort of a unique perspective, but maybe it's not so unique, that I've been here twice in different decades in Miami, and I've seen the city change quite a bit. So I was here in 2002, right after graduation, and I came back in 2016 with a family. And so obviously the first time around I was in the high rises by the water, and the second time around I was in the houses on kind of western part of Miami. But I made a list of what I noticed had changed, and I thought that might be a little bit of a framework for this discussion. So the most obvious change is that we have a metro mover system in downtown, right? A free train. I know there were battles back and forth, but by the time I got here, it was free, and it works really well to get around between Brickell and downtown and up to kind of that Wynwood area, Edgewater. And so that's one change, and that's linked to the Metro Rail, which has obviously been around a long time. But when I was here in 02, it was just kind of doing the southern part of the city. By the time I came back, it had an extension to the airport. And that's something you cannot do in New York. You cannot go from the city to the airport in any way that's realistic for anybody who doesn't have 3 hours and is going to go changing stations and go up and down flights of stairs. So that's another one. The kind of on this transportation side, the Bright Line, is the semi high-speed rail system that now comes out of Miami all the way to Palm Beach, and will then go on to Orlando. So that side, and on the trains, let's say, the trolley system that now it's also kind of a free. I try to explain to my children why trolleys are different than buses, and the only thing I can explain is that trolleys are brightly colored and they're free. City buses you have to pay for. But you can get from Coral Gables, along Coral Way into Brickell, and which is what I do for work very often. Don't have to drive and I don't have to pay. And there's obviously Coral Gables trolley, and all the cities have their own trolley system, which I've been told this is the 25 cents at work or something that we're paying for in some way. But at least it's come together. And then the other side that's not transportation related is the museums. So I have children, and the Frost Science Museum and the PAM just were not there at all before. And they're truly world class. I love taking visitors to see the Frost Science with that's obviously the Bayside location, and the way it's designed for children of all ages, and then adults with them. And obviously that didn't just happen. So I think, to me, it was such a big change. Over like 2002, Miami is just a suburban city on the beach, and you come here for shopping and beaches. But I come back, and now all of a sudden you have this dense urban core with some transportation in and out, and these museums that are now coming in. Obviously, Art Basel building on that, and just this energy around the city. So maybe kind of I'll pause there, and maybe Andres, I think you would go first. Maybe you can talk about what you've seen, and obviously your longer time frame being here.
Sure. And I just wanted, before I start, I wanted to just remark on the role that Parker Thompson, Princeton grad, and the late Parker Thompson, and who's very active with the club as well, the role that he played in this whole transformation, because he was really the guy behind what's now the Arsht Center for the Performing Arts, and that was years and years of effort. And so, he was one of the early visionaries that saw a different Miami when it was a very different place. So I just wanted to remember him for a moment.
And we should mention his daughter
Yes,
picked up that legacy in Meg Daly and laying out the underline. So
the underline, which is
yeah,
well underway now.
yeah.
Right. So I thought I would make this kind of a little personal, because I think there's a different Miami depending on, it's kind of as Lauren said, when you got here, how long you've been here. You've seen a different city, because that's how often it transforms. I mean, it seems to just completely change every few years. And the old joke, and this does underlie a lot of the changes. The old joke was, when Fidel Castro sneezes, Miami catches a cold. And so a lot of the ups and downs that you've seen, at least that I have seen, have to do with events elsewhere in Latin America, not just Latin America, but especially in Latin America. And that, really, that makes us, I think, unique in a lot of ways. But my own personal experience is I'm class of 81. I worked for 2 years in New York for the Associated Press, and they shipped me down to Miami because it's a little bit like the Army. And I had never set foot in Miami. And so I remember my first Saturday night, I had been in New York. I'd seen kind of Soho change and start to become what it eventually became. I grew up in San Juan, Puerto Rico. I had seen the colonial section preserved, restored, protected. So I kind of had a sense of what historic preservation and reuse of these old buildings could do for a city in taking it to the next level. So I had heard about this Art Deco district. I thought, oh, this is great. I'm first Saturday night in Miami. I'm hitting the Art Deco district. I'm going to see what's happening. And I remember coming over the bridge to South Beach, and it was just dark, pitch black. And I'm going, what the heck is going on here? And I drove up Ocean Drive, and there was literally nowhere to buy a Coke on a Saturday night on Ocean Drive. So that just gives you the baseline for those who weren't here there at that point of how far the place has come. And it's really kind of inconceivable in a lot of ways. And just to add another note, because my first job was at the old Miami Beach neighbor's office of the Miami Herald. And so I, was there to see the burgeoning preservation of the Art Deco district, South Beach. And, the city policy at the time was to tear everything down. They wanted to tear all of it down. There was even a ban south of 5th Street on doing any improvements to your property. So of course it became an instant slum. I mean, it's just hard to conceive of today. But, in that day when I got here, I had asked a friend who had been in the Miami posting before, said, where do I live? They said, the only place is Coconut Grove. And it really was the only place that had kind of activity at night, a couple restaurants, some bars, a great movie art house that disappeared a few years ago, unfortunately. And believe it or not, people at the time would go to Fort Lauderdale if they wanted some nightlife, because that's where the clubs were.
Wow.
And my wife, who grew up here, said that, she went to Palmetto High School. Nobody ever went to South Beach for any reason, at least any licit reason. And as you know, it was called God's waiting room. It was old folks at the end of their lives, basically. And it took outsiders in a way to start recognizing the value of this. And I mean, I think this is important because I think South Beach was really the moment that saved Miami in a lot of ways. What happened there? I mean, the mainland where I lived, aside from Coconut Grove, is a very dark moment, literally and figuratively, in the city's history. In 1980, Time Magazine, which, believe it or not, was probably the most important news publication in the country back then, had a cover story saying South Florida Paradise Lost. Now, they did have a question mark, but you read the story and it is just a almost gleeful disemboweling of Miami at the time. We had the Mariel boat lift that brought 125,000 Cuban refugees that were living under tents under I-95. We had a very bad period in terms of boat people coming over from Haiti, because a lot of them drowned on the way and would I mean, this is a little morbid perhaps, but there were bodies literally washing up on the beaches. Miami at the time was a murder capital of the United States, the highest murder rate in the country. And so, I don't want to get too dark here, but this is just to set a baseline. And when you fast forward to today, it's just a completely different city. It's kind of like those ruins that are excavated where there's different levels below. It's a city that's been really kind of made over in a lot of ways. And it started in the 80s with the South Beach revival. It took really there were feints added, but it took serious money from outside, New York especially. Tony Goldman coming in, starting to buy hotels. And Goldman is, of course, the guy who then started Wynwood Walls after that. He had been one of the original investors in bringing back Soho, as a matter of fact. So he's a guy who recognized these things. And it took that kind of money and the really quality renovations to get people to start looking at Miami in a different way. And then comes Miami Vice. Miami Vice changed everything because they created a Miami that didn't exist, a glamorous, glamorous nightclubs, and those just didn't exist. They would take over these hotels and build these sets in the basement. And then life started imitating TV. And that was kind of the origin of that. And there was also, a couple of visionary mayors, Maurice Ferré and Manny Diaz later on, both in Miami, who started to see these possibilities for what, Lawrence, you called kind of a suburban city the first time you were here, which it really was, into a more urban city. So Ferré, who was mayor in the 70s primarily, is the one who started pushing for the first residential towers on Britain. So when I got here, the first few had opened, and there was a completely new concept, urban living downtown. This is when everybody had all the construction that was taking place was out on the periphery, Kendall, West Miami-Dade. I mean, if you went down the Turnpike extension, there were just farmland as far as you could see on both sides. So in the 80s, it all starts to change, and it's perception. And I would recommend, if anybody can, let me see if I can get this. Well, Miami City of the Future, which T.D. Allman, and I'm sorry it's out of focus, T.D. Allman wrote this book. He was the first to recognize, a journalist from outside, from New York, that this city had enormous potential. And if you could see, you would see the cover here is the Atlantis, which Lizz's former firm designed. And that's the one with the hole and the palm tree in the middle of Brooklyn. And that really started to change the image of Miami. And Miami Vice used that as well. So, there have been various kind of ups and downs. There was a condo collapse in the 80s when all these condos started going bankrupt. And again, because the money wasn't coming in from, I think at that point it might have been Venezuelans, with the oil boom. That money then started leaving, condos collapsed. There was a lull for a while. But it's interesting how, these successive waves build and pick up on the rest of it. So that's the period also, Lawrence, as you point out, when Metro Rail was built. Ground was starting to get laid for the planning of the Performing Arts Center. And so there really were these people like Parker Thompson who had a vision. And as you mentioned, it didn't happen completely by accident. There were people who really saw a different sort of Miami and laid the groundwork. But, really, it took just a lot of investment, and foreign flight money and money laundering was always a big element in the development of each level of Miami. There was one point where the Federal Reserve did an analysis of the branch here of cash, and some significant percentage of the paper currency had traces of cocaine on it. I mean, that is literally true. And that's what fueled a lot of the development in that era in Miami. And there's some people who feel that it still does. So in the 80s, things start to pick up. Then you've got the 90s, and just Lincoln Road starts up again. I mean, Lincoln Road was also completely dead. And some local operators, restaurant owners, like the people who own Sport Cafe, that's now Rosanella, were among the first to open up on Lincoln Road. And they start attracting people. And a lot of these are outsiders because, you know, again, the locals didn't necessarily appreciate this. And there's always been this push and pull between also what's being lost, right? So the old timers felt that the city was changing, and they always have, but the city was changing too fast. And this is not the Miami that they love. Now, there was one advantage at the time: you could get anywhere in 20 minutes. You could, you know, jump in your car, and that's no longer possible. But, you know, there are areas that were always still quite nice. Coral Gables, even though Miracle Mile at that point didn't allow cafe tables on the sidewalks, and it shut down at 5 p.m. every night, which is another change. But then once the big money started coming into South Beach, people, I think, started realizing and taking a look at the mainland of Miami as well, and all the possibilities there. Living, you know, on the water, on the bay. And so really a lot has been driven by developers, despite, you know, attempts at master plans here and there, but it's just developers building condos for flight capital, money laundering, and, you know, some people who actually lived in them as well, which has made, I think, all the difference. And the Manny Diaz administration made great strides because they're the ones who also saw a different Miami and sponsored the Miami 21 rezoning that Liz will talk about, because she was somewhat involved in that. And that, you know, also an answer to your question, Lawrence, to some degree, changed the whole way that Miami's built, and the way, and a lot of it is just kind of, you know, maybe technical, little dry, but the way buildings meet the street. I mean, if you see the towers from before, they were built on an open garage, nothing on the ground floor. You know, street life was kind of dead. And the whole idea was to bring that kind of active street life to the city. And that's what really, to my mind, you know, the timing was good in a lot of ways. The developers had no choice but to build this way. And that really is what created the Brickell that we know today, the, you know, the somewhat resurgent downtown Miami. I think that will happen. And even now, you know, Coral Gables is adopting this for the downtown, this very urban model, again, with a lot of pushback from residents always. And I would, just to kind of wrap up, because I think a lot of this discussion will depend on you guys' questions. But the one issue that still hasn't been solved, even though Metro Rail did manage to get itself to the airport finally, that was just supposed to be the first line of a network that covered the entire county. And that has never happened. And, you know, the car dependency obviously is rampant. People love their cars. I think a lot of people don't want to give up their cars. But on the planning end, it's been just very, very difficult. Aside from the trolleys, which are buses, Lawrence, by the way, they're just dressed up buses. You know, but aside from these networks, if you want to get from where I am in Coral Gables to Doral, there's only one way, you know. And as we become kind of a little bit like LA, I always joke that LA is what Miami wants to be when it grows up. It's just kind of where there's multiple urban centers, like Doral, and people will live close and work close, I think. And that's where we're headed. So if you want to be in Brickell, you want to be downtown, you want to be in the action, you're going to be there, but you're not going to be driving across the county, because it's just requires a lot of planning, take forever. Anyway, so I'll close there, but I think everybody knows where Miami is today. I don't need to harp too much on that, but I just wanted to lay that kind of baseline to give you an idea of just how far we've come.
Great. Thank you so much, Andres. Liz, take it away.
Liz, you're muted.
You muted, Liz.
Thank you. Thank you, Lawrence. And how great to see a lot of friends on the screen, or at least some of your names. But you know, when Lawrence suggested that we do something like this, he told a story that I didn't even know was possible nowadays in Miami, is that you have an app, and if you're going to take the trolley downtown, the Coral Gables trolley down Coral Way to go downtown or to Brickell, that'll tell you apparently how close the trolley bus is, so that you don't have to stand out there forever waiting for it. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah,
That's true.
Yeah. So, you know, that is a remarkable and forward, a remarkably advanced component of transit, which we should be proud that we have, because I think many of us don't even realize that it exists. But as part of Andres's stories about earlier Miami, I was thinking of two books that give a kind of deeper background of some of the ethos of the place, which has to do with it being at the end of the peninsula and far away from the rest of the country. And one of those books is Ralph Munro's memoir, which I think you can only buy in the History Museum, which is essentially a story being told by the builder of, I'm forgetting the park that was his house in Coconut Grove that you can visit.
Barnacle.
Barnacle, thank you. And he talks about how people were here because they didn't want to be somewhere else, and they didn't particularly want to be sociable, and that this was a place that people were getting away from other places. And then, you know, the kind of illicit businesses that caused shipwrecks, so that the shipwreckers would have something to do, and so on. And then there's John Rothschild's Up for Grabs, which is a bigger story of especially Southern Florida, and the whole kind of land scams and speculation that we were maybe long ago famous for, but oh, there it is, which underlies, for which there's still some connection for the amount of kind of speculative development that goes on here. So, you know, we have a different kind of extraction economy, and both of those offer you, I think, some humorous background for it, but maybe some of that's still going on in a different way. Anyway, so Andres mentioned that he came here in '81. I arrived in '76. It was a recession, the oil recession up north, no work for architects. And so it seemed like a good idea. Actually, we at Architectonica thought we were on our way to South America to work, but we stopped here. And at that time, there was no place where you could really live and walk to anything, to stores or, well, I lived in North Coral Gables in the apartments, and Andres and I used to walk down to Miracle Mile in the dark, everything in the dark, as Andres points out. And now we have multiple.
Different Andres, I should point out.
Yes, Andres Duane. And now we have multiple centers that are walkable, where you can, with the revival of South Beach, and I'll mention a few of them. And the Herald actually did a story on the many different kind of urban centers like that have mixed uses, and you can live in an apartment or a townhouse, or even nearby in a single family house and walk to it. So one of the first things that actually a Princetonian suggested that I do when I arrived in town was to join the Dade Heritage Trust, which was a brand new preservation society begun by Sally Jude and Dolly McIntyre, and which was an outgrowth of the Villagers, which was also a women's group. And these were very prominent, huge efforts to save things around town, including saving Douglas Entrance at the corner of Douglas and 8th Street, which was in danger of being torn down, saving the Biltmore Hotel, which was UM's med school building, but slated for tearing down. This battle's not over, by the way, especially with some recent state legislation. But a lot of people have put a lot of effort into saving some of the cultural history. And by the way, a third book that's worth reading is Arva Parks's History of George Merrick, and the phenomenal intensity of early Coral Gables development is just, even in our day, unbelievable, or barely believable. But anyway, another person in that mode, of course, was Barbara Capitman, who was a very loud, and I might add whiny, but effective voice for the saving and the restoration, the preservation of Miami Beach, the Art Deco district, along with the interior design industry. The interior designers saw it for what it was much earlier, I would say, than even my profession, the architects. And there was no place to sit down and eat outdoors. There was the Sands in Key Biscayne, the only outdoor restaurant facing the ocean. And so a group that some of us architects who were teaching at the University of Miami, and that's the reason we came down, because that was a job difficult to find in the 70s and 80s. We started something called the Architectural Club of Miami, which brought speakers to town. And one day we put out some tables and chairs and wine and bread on the sidewalk outside of the venue of the lectures to promote this idea that maybe outdoor dining, as the rest of the world was already accustomed to, might be a good idea for Miami. Not that that had any particular effect, but there were a bunch of people who were beginning to think and talk about other ways of being than just suburbia. The Miami Design Preservation League, with which Barbara Capitman was effectively an effective voice for. Neeson Kasdan later became the mayor of Miami Beach, led that. And so there was an interesting kind of building up of even civic participation through some of these organizations about making this a better place. Now, Andres mentioned a whole bunch of very important things, like the 1980 Mariel moment or years. But one of the important ones of the 90s was Hurricane Andrew. And there was a great deal of, I think, a great deal of thinking about how this could be a better place, more resilient, particularly in South Dade and the extension of the bus line. A number of things grew out of some of the planning, volunteer planning efforts, I should say, that followed that. Even now, I think you're seeing how some of the towns, the recently incorporated towns along that route, are making plans for their own town squares and walkable centers in places where it really was just roads, houses, and strip centers for a long time. Downtown Dadeland, which is now growing to be one of these urban centers, grew out of that period. Chamber South was the organization that initiated that. Again, a non-for-profit, volunteers. Dover Coal, a South Miami firm, was important in that, but I was lucky to participate in some of the planning for that. And it was very interesting in that period to see a group of people, business people, residents, and others really saying, let's try to make this a better place. The downtown Dadeland charrette had 1,000 Friends of Florida involved. South Florida Water Management said they would, under the leadership of Sam Poole, said they could alter the canals if we wanted to. Of course, that never happened. And any number of other people who said, yes, this is logically a place for urbanism because there's a train station here and lots of highways meet here. And sure enough, slowly it's growing up to be that. It needs a lot of refinement, but the beginnings are there. The stadium, the arena downtown, there were lots of kind of moments of trying to make something big happen. And then moving the arena onto the waterfront caused, and then pretty soon a proposal for a stadium, the baseball stadium on the waterfront, caused some of us to start the Urban Environment League to prevent that from happening. And there was some very interesting, huge planning effort. Again, Victor Dober was involved in this to determine how that park, which should have been park, but clearly was going to be used for something else, how it might have a different life than a stadium. And that's where the two museums are now.
Okay.
And so, and I should point out that there was some research being done by folks at Princeton that pointed out that civic facilities like museums have a much larger economic throw-off impact on a city and on their surroundings than sports venues do. Now about, let's say, so, okay, so we're into the years 2000. And in 2009, we started hearing, because there was a citizens committee started by Harvey Reuven, who's one of our great environmental leaders, safely ensconced as county clerk, but still promoting sustainability and green things. And by the way, he helped make happen, there's a Habitat for Humanity neighborhood in South Dade that was a result after the hurricane that Harvey promoted. That's one of these little walkable neighborhoods. Anyway, in 2009, he called a bunch of people together to start talking about climate change. And most of us had barely heard about it. And most of us thought that this was too complicated for anybody to work on. What a pain in the neck to start thinking about this. And very slowly, a group of people became quite informed. And now, of course, I teach a course in climate change adaptation at the university. But that started a very slow discussion, you know, and at first you couldn't talk about things like retreat, you know, that might be in the future, or any of the sort of thing, the scenarios that we need to be working on. And it really was Miami Beach taking the bull by the horn and saying, we're going to raise some streets, put in some pumps, and we're going to show you how to do it in more recent years. And so now the focus is on that. And I think in a big way, there's some good examples of small things that, small and large things that people have done to start working on it. So I'm looking at my notes. I think I might stop here.
Liz, can you talk about Miami 21?
Yes, okay. So in 2004 or 5, maybe a year before that, Mayor Diaz went to something called the Mayor's Institute, which is an annual conference which calls together mayors. The National Endowment for the Arts used to run this to talk about design in their cities. And he was, I think, at that Mayor's Institute that he attended, and he was also the head of the League of Cities for a while. He realized that it was important to think about Miami in qualitative ways, not just quantitative ways. And so my firm was asked to revise the code for the city of Miami. And to the mayor's credit, he said, you're not just going to change a few things, you're going to start over. And of course, you can't really start over because there's incredible amounts of value vested in all the private property. But he understood during a boom time, you know, this was before the 2008 2009 recession, that the horse was not entirely out of the barn yet, and that the city was going to continue growing, and that it was worth taking the time to try to get it right. And so we brought this idea of a form-based code that focuses on the quality of the public space as the private buildings form it as its primary goal. I mean, it's still based on the old health, safety, and welfare legal underpinnings of codes, but it adds another component related to what the streets and sidewalks are like, how the buildings form the quality of those spaces. And Andres mentioned one of the issues, which is lining the parking garages so they're hiding behind stores or apartments, which of course makes a lot of sense, especially facing the bay, where those apartments that are hiding the parking garage can be worth quite a bit. But it had a lot of the ability to have an effect in other parts of the city as well. The first things that you saw were that banks and drugstores, as they were building out after the 2008 recession, were putting their front doors on the sidewalk instead of behind a parking lot. And that may seem like a small difference, but in the long run, if we start seeing all the sidewalks connected with building fronts and frequent doors and windows, it'll be a lot safer and more interesting city to live and walk to the trolley in. I hope that's enough about Miami 21. Anyway, we didn't want to spend too much time without starting a discussion with the group that's here.
I wanted to point out, not to be remiss, Charles Treaster's here, and his father, Kenneth, was one of these visionaries as well, or is still. He designed the Mayfair in Coconut Grove, which really also transformed the Grove, I think, in a positive way. It was a little controversial maybe at the time. Unfortunately, it's been really Bowdlerized, at least the commercial part. It was an incredible experience to walk through what was really sort of an enclosed mall, yet it was open, and these incredible gardens, and you just weave your way through them. And the only remnant of the original, and thank goodness there's been a recent renovation, which is the hotel portion. So if you really want to kind of take a trip back to a golden era of Coconut Grove previous to the current one, I would recommend that you visit the Mayfair Hotel and the incredible atrium, which is really where you see the best of Ken Treaster's work today, I think, outside maybe of the Holocaust Memorial on South Beach. But anyway, I just wanted to bring that up.
Good, thank you.
So let's open it up for, I think that's great setup. Let's open up for questions. Pat, has anyone written, or how should we do this?
Nothing on the chat. So I think if you just unmute and ask, and I'll kick off with one for you, Liz. How optimistic are you about downtown Miami now that so many of the buildings are in the hands of one developer?
Well, I'm not sure about one. You might be speaking about Flagler Street in particular.
Yes.
But I think that, as Andres pointed out in the Sunday Herald a couple weeks ago, there's really a lot of projects that are upcoming. In terms of one holder of property along a commercial or retail street, that could have very good results, because that represents the kind of control that effective retail places enjoy. I don't know if it's going in that direction. Certainly, I'm not privy to the specifics of it. But we are about to see a tremendous amount of new building, if what Andres wrote about even begins to happen, all over the downtown area and its adjacent areas. it's moving into Little Havana and up towards the design district in Alapata even. There's the new big building on the river past the med school area. So we're still at it.
I mean, it's amazing how far we've come, but it's amazing how far we still have to go. I think that should be noted, and how much potential there is. Certainly, I mean, there's still a lot of ground that has not been redeveloped. And there's this whole somewhat controversial idea of high ground becoming more valuable as climate change pushes, the water tables and water into the and over the shoreline. But I think, some of these areas are clearly at some point going to be the new centers of development. And I'm talking about what used to be called the inner city, Little Haiti, that's been discussed for years, what's going to happen there, but that's high ground. And there's a lot of just bare vacant land there right now, a lot of speculators just holding on to it for that day when this happens. And so even though all the action, if you will, that we've seen has been Brickell downtown, I think, and things could always change. I mean, we're a boom bust cycle. We've been on a very extended boom, but a bust is sure to come at some point, maybe sooner rather than later. But at some point, I think that's going to be the new frontier for Miami, those kind of outlying neighborhoods, if you will.
Liz, what did you think about the heat arena being on the water? I mean, in other words, it does bring people to the water. There is something to it. It doesn't seem like it's maximized the water experience. Certainly the Marlins Stadium did make it there. It was at the old Orange Bowl site. But what are your thoughts about having a public arena that it doesn't look out onto the water, but it does get people to the water, it does focus population on the water? So what are your thoughts about the heat arena from an architectural standpoint and from just a use standpoint for the public?
Well, that's a great question. First of all, there's a space in back of the arena that still is an opportunity for facing the water in a different way. But just think of the back of the arena facing the water and the museum. That museum by Herzog and de Moor on the Pam landed, I think, very well in town. I think people immediately began to like it. Nobody, as far as I know, nobody really hated it. That's hard for architecture these days sometimes. And the idea that it has that wonderful outdoor porch, that huge porch, which has events on it and so on, and offers that kind of space for the public, is really very different than the arena. But there is an opportunity. It gets discussed from time to time about that back, whatever it is, behind the arena. Now, connected to that is something that is happening, and we could speed up, which is the Baywalk, and which is connected to a river walk. And many of you may have been out there on some pieces of it, and I find it to be quite a charmed piece of our city, where, and especially behind some of the buildings, you see people walking with baby prams and walking their dogs and small children and having conversations. And it's a different kind of public space that if we could finish it, make the connections. And so the back of the arena is part of that. It's already being studied how to get it under the bridges and so on. And it goes all the way up to Edgewater. So it could connect over to the design district. It's already has pieces of it along the riverfront. And so that could be one of our most important public spaces in town. And those buildings or developments that haven't quite taken advantage of that waterfront still have the opportunity, I think, to remake themselves for that. So even though the arena is dark most of the time, or whatever one might critique it for occupying such an important place, it has the opportunity for making a contribution, a different kind of contribution. And while it stays there, it doesn't need to leave. And even the kind of crossing to get into Bayside, into the park south of it, I think there's lots of room for people to work on, improvements to be worked on.
And I wanted to jump in because Pat mentioned the underline. And in fact, the strategy or the hope is that the Riverwalk, which would eventually extend almost to the, not quite to the airport, but to the industrial end of the river. It's a fascinating place if you've never been. I mean, it's incredible, huge cargo ships that somehow managed to dock back there. But that Riverwalk could connect to the underline, to the Liz, what's the other route that Victor has been working on?
The one that goes down to
Dadeland.
To
So there
Dadeland.
could be eventually a connected loop really all around the city that takes you down the river, up the bay, down the bay, and all the way out west. And that would be pretty amazing. And it's been proceeding, as Liz said, in fits and starts or sections. I did a couple of years ago during the pandemic. I got a new bike and I went exploring to try to find the Riverwalk. And let me tell you, you have to be quite the explorer to find the bits and pieces because they're all disconnected. But it's really interesting landscape out there. And again, this is one of these things where if you've been elsewhere in another city, you see the potential. I mean, if you've ever been to Chicago and been along the river and the amazing things they've done there, that's another vision for what Miami could be. And we're, again, always in the process of becoming something else.
We paddle up the river quite often, and I see more and more small restaurants opening up. They are set up outdoors. Oftentimes they have live music, and I definitely recognize the potential there.
Ben Liang asked us to turn our eyes northward to Broward County and talk a little about development trends up there. I'm sure, Liz, you have your eyes on our neighbor and what they're doing in Fort Lauderdale. Any observations?
Well, I think you'll find that the downtown area, there's a focus on urbanizing the downtown. There are neighborhoods that are rebuilding to be a denser and more walkable, pedestrian friendly with a diversity of housing. It's interesting, Broward doesn't have the Miami-Dade controversy about ag land development, which is in the news in the county these days locally, because in fact, the whole county is developed and there are a number of municipalities that it already is, but they, I would say, have the same challenges ahead of retrofitting the suburban sprawl to begin to make it more less vehicle dependent and more walkable and transit friendly, certainly as our western edges do. Did you have in mind in particular?
No, I just wanted to hear more because I'm still young and I want to learn more about architecture and just general city development. So it's been really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I did a story on the kind of the Fort Lauderdale downtown boom a couple of years ago, before the pandemic. It seems everything happened before the pandemic. But that's been another kind of, it was a very deliberate choice by the city property owners to really up their game, because I think they felt they were honestly falling behind to Miami. I think, and again, I mentioned early on when people in Miami, when I got here in the 80s, used to go to Fort Lauderdale for fun. Believe it or not. And that sort of Fort Lauderdale just kind of, you know, they stayed the same. And so we I think pass them, and a few years ago they decided they needed to really start redeveloping the downtown, and they've done a really good job, because even before we did, they had the Performing Arts Center there, they had the new Science Museum there, they had a Riverwalk, which is really nice, and Las Olas Boulevard came back, revived. It's a really fun place to go, and they started developing the neighborhoods to the north of, is it Broward Boulevard, I believe, that goes to the center of downtown. So they really have their own version of Wynwood. It's really kind of interesting. And then now around the new Brightline station, there's a whole urban neighborhood growing up around there, because developers have seen the potential. So, you know, the potential is, if you can't afford or can't stand Brickell, I mean, a lot of people can't, you could live in downtown Fort Lauderdale, hop on the Brightline, and be in downtown Miami at your job in half an hour. And I think that's a vision that people do have.
Speaking of Brickell, Fernando Iglesias asked about this new construction on Brickell Bay Drive, and he talks about a 40-story condo, but I think the Citadel headquarters is double that. And his question is, how can you rationalize that, both from a traffic as well as from just a structural standpoint? Can Miami really support? I know there's a limestone underbed, right, that all of these tall buildings are based on, but can we really build a whole series of super tall buildings here like they're doing in Manhattan?
Who's going to answer that? Well,
First of all,
in terms of construction, you know, they drive piles very deep, and essentially they are those piles are the foundation of the buildings, and I think some of them go as deep as 80 feet. I mean, it's quite amazing. Maybe Charles knows better about that, but you know, that compresses the limestone, and also just sets up a very thick mat of these columns that these buildings sit on. So I think that what's happening with the water, either from underground or from the ocean, may not have a lot of effect on that part of it. But there is, I think, hovering this question of, you know, how long will there be a kind of viability overall in the region in terms of that many people being here, services, jobs. You know, right now we are beginning to see that we have a big job for raising some streets, or whatever the protection that's going to occur for Brickell and downtown, the various proposals that are happening. These are all very expensive infrastructure. And, you know, I think what we should be spending some of that money, if we're going to be spending public money on the infrastructure, we should be making the places where people are walking now into the quality that they could be, sidewalks, pavements, and so on. And the transportation that Andres mentioned, all with a view to what that window of staying here is, and what those scenarios might be. So there's a certain amount of scenarios and research, I think, that need to be done to kind of set up the priorities of what we do and don't do, to ensure that all these people who are coming here can stay for a good amount of time.
You mentioned public monies. Will there be any funding from the infrastructure bill or climate bill you foresee coming our way in South Florida?
Well, Andres and I were talking about this, Andres Viglucci and I, because there should be, and I presume that our transportation and public transportation agencies and public works departments are working on that, a way of getting it, but we don't read about it.
Well, that's an excellent question, and actually, it's one worth asking. They must have applications or preparing applications as we speak. But Liz is right; it hasn't been written about, maybe because it's still at a preliminary stage. What I can tell you, though, that a lot of this is really going to fall on us to pay for. I mean, the city of Miami Beach, they have the advantage, of course, that they can soak the tourists to pay for a lot of this stuff, because the city's only 80,000 people, but when you add in tourists, I think it triples in size. And that's how they're paying for a lot of these street elevation projects, is through the transportation taxes. And they have a requirement now where if you build a new commercial building, your second story has to be, I think, at least 10, 12 stories high, so that eventually when they raise the streets, the second story can become the first story of your building. Which is kind of interesting. And in Key Biscayne, little village of Key Biscayne, very wealthy, the voters there just approved $100 million bond program for resiliency, because they realize they're only, I think, 2 feet, 3 feet maybe above sea level, that they're going to have to do a lot if they're going to stay there.
Can I jump in?
Go ahead.
Anyway, it's nice to see Liz and Andres and everyone else. I wanted to follow up on Joe's question about the arena and talk about it in a little bit broader sense. And I'd love to hear Liz's view on this, because I know you've been doing projects and studying cities all over the world, and through your firm, all the planning you've been doing. One of the issues I think cities always, we have our public space and our private space. Miami obviously has been really fundamentally built by private development, private citizens throughout our whole history, and which is one of our strengths, clearly. But then when you get into the public realm and you're talking about, in the broad sense, parkland and civic spaces, we've mentioned, people have mentioned, the Performing Arts Center, which is a civic space. But when you take parkland, let's just talk about that for big picture, and where the arena was built and where the the beautiful museum that Liz mentioned that Herzog and de Meuron did a great job on, those were all parkland. We've also just recently taken the largest piece of parkland in the city, and for the ostensible purpose of building a sports arena, which obviously sports is a big, a hot button in most people that's in America we love our sports, and I love our sports. We're all big sports fans. But that land was now turned over largely for private development. So the question I posed to Liz and Andres, you're a urban person who studies urban issues. What can we do from a civic point of view in terms of civic involvement? Obviously, private developers, and I am one as well, we're all motivated to do projects, and that's what we like to do, and make buildings and make places. But the parks are sort of under the custodianship of the public, whatever that means, and our government, who we are elected officials. So how do we, as citizens, what can we be doing more, or how can we be organizing ourselves better? And maybe if you could just, I know that's a very broad question, but maybe there's some examples that come to mind through your travels of what we could be doing differently to preserve and enhance those kind of spaces.
And Andres, maybe when you answer, for both of you, Liz, it might be a good closing discussion on our involvement. I think Miami's dynamic and changes so fast because it's individuals and small groups of people who do things. If you could talk about what we could do, types of organizations.
Yeah, it's like Charles must have been listening in on our organizational meeting, because that's actually, I think, right, Liz, where we thought would be a good place to take this.
So, I wish we had a list in front of us, Charles. I don't know if anybody does. I don't know if the United Way does. Maybe that's my homework after this, is to go find out who's doing what. The Urban Environment League was, which had Dan Paul as one, attorney Dan Paul, as one of its cheerleaders and leaders, and Greg Bush has left town, is not, still exists apparently, could be revived. And that was really focused on parks. We do have one good parks story, which is the County Parks Department under Maria Nardi's leadership is doing terrific amount of good. They have a great parks master plan in which it proffers that our streets and boulevards should be considered part of the park system, that we should be greening the places that people walk. It's good for climate. I mean, it's the one silver bullet is planting trees in terms of climate mitigation. But you could imagine the linear connections between the really quite few green spaces that we have. When we worked on Miami 21, it was pointed out by Peter Harnick, who's a researcher and author about parks nationally, that we had one of the lowest ratios of park space to resident. And that was, more than 10 years ago. And everybody says, well, there's the bay or there's the beach or the Everglades, but the kind of daily use of parks, I think, is what we should be concerned about. And the rest of the public realm, so imagining that the streets are our parks could be a way of really dealing with infrastructure as well as the spaces for people. But, all those people that we mentioned along the way who were effective at some point in the changes, the kind of benchmarks of changes in our memory are older than we are. And there needs to be, I think, a new generation of people who, and especially the new people coming into town. We need you to start worrying, expressing your concern about these things, and perhaps trying to get together to see what the next things that need to be done are. We have a whole series of wicked problems down here, and parks and open space, certainly the need for that is one of those. Affordability is another one, climate change, and preservation, which is under attack in a big way again. And so there's work to be done. That you don't need to be bored.
Well, and we were discussing this earlier and saying that, as long time people here, that we're hoping the people come from New York, where you're perhaps accustomed to more developed, more sophisticated public realm, will start demanding some of these changes here. Now it's difficult. All these folks who used to do this, people get tired. The battles here are really very hard, and they wear people out. And I think there is a need for new organizations. Now, Dade Heritage Trust is still around and still very active. And they're very good. They're quietly, I think, pretty effective. So that's one organization that if anyone's interested, you should look into. They're based in Brickell. They do walking tours. They do cycling tours. They do all kinds of events. They have a publication. That's one group that's still very active. They have a board that's very representative. But some of the other groups have really kind of faded away. And there is the Everglades Foundation. So if anybody's interested in the Everglades, that's another one. I think the Audubon Society is still somewhat active. There's Miami Waterkeeper. They're right at the forefront of defending the bay, Biscayne Bay, which right now is in steep decline. And it's in very bad shape. There was a huge fish die-off the other day, thousands of fish washing up and floating in the water. So that's another group to get involved in, and then start your own group. I mean, as a reporter, I'll tell you, it's frustrating for me because there's no organization, or there's very few organizations for me to turn to when I want a viewpoint of people who are fighting for a park or fighting to preserve a neighborhood. There's just, you know, I have nothing against development. If it weren't for developers, we'd all be living in trees, as you know. But you know, sometimes there's an imbalance, and right now the developers are really running the town. You know, maybe I shouldn't say this, but city of Miami in particular is a dysfunctional mess right now. The county, you know, God bless, that's pretty well run for the most part. But just think of the constant relentless pressure on our park space. There is this person now who is pushing to build a University of Miami football stadium in Tropical Park, which is a historic park. It's one of the most heavily used recreational spaces in the county because it's in an area that doesn't have a lot of parks. It's a beautiful spot. You go there any time of day. There's people, there's a, you know, an equestrian center, there's lakes, people out, you know, with the little paddle boats. I mean, the soccer, you know, my kids played soccer there. It is oversubscribed. And yet, you know, some freelance billionaire decides that this is a place to plunk down a football stadium. And, you know, right now, I mean, the county has sort of given him the cold shoulder. University of Miami, I think, has given him the cold shoulder, but it's just these people are relentless. You know, just like, as Charles mentioned, the turnover of the golf course by the airport over to a private interest, really. And even though they say it's a soccer stadium, it's really just a massive development that happens to have a little soccer stadium, you know, in the middle of it. But there's no, right now, there's no counterweight to that, is I guess the point I'm trying to make. And so these decisions are just sort of steamrolled through. And so when this fellow, and I forget his name, wants to do this thing, Tropical Park, you really kind of, you know, I use that park, you start to worry, you know, he could just eventually get his way. And then there goes one more gem. And I'm surprised, Liz, by the way, HOK is apparently working with him on some plan for that, you know.
It's John Ruiz is his name. I've cross-examined him. I know him well.
Off the record later, you can tell me.
Yeah. Yeah. So no, it's a little bit of it's a concern. It's a concern. I just think that he's not skilled enough to really pull this off. But who knows? Just like you mentioned, Andre, it's the you know, the golf course is gone or will be gone soon. So these things are possible.
Okay, on that somber note.
Well, no, look, we should end on a positive note.
I have a question, one more question. I also want to say hello to Liz. Thank you for giving this presentation. I always enjoy it. And it's good to see a classmate. But my question is with regards to the residential areas. When I first came, Miami City and the beach were dilapidated, but Coral Gables, for example, even Pinecrest, looked very attractive. Now what I see when I drive through, I oftentimes see that new buyers totally demolish the old structure and put on something that in my eyes looks like a monstrosity. Are there any limits as to what people can do with the original and how they can replace them?
Well, in most of the cities, there's the issue of preservation. Is it something that can, you know, the preservation of buildings and the control of new building in order to preserve old buildings is a kind of fraught legal question. And some of the cities have navigated it pretty well, but it's under assault again with preemptive laws at the state level. But the kind of white boxes that are entering into many neighborhoods, replacing the old one or one small two-story house, most of the codes don't have limits on that. When we wrote Miami 21, we did produce a volume limit for the single family houses. But of course, it's not probably as much as most people would like to see. And so that's, it's the kind of molting of the city. It's just changing in that way. And, you know, unless there's, as Andres put it, a good counterweight, we don't have the counterweight to the forces, which include people coming from all over the country to live here and pay less taxes here, which is very hard to fight. Also, remember, we have a limited supply of land. Unlike any other metropolitan area, we have boundaries all around us. Every other large city in the country can grow in at least 3 directions. And we can grow into our agricultural land. And that's something that I think we're hanging on to by our fingernails. But the pressure, just because of the small size that we are, is huge. And now that the doors have been opened for the whole north of the country, desiring to be in Florida. And it's not just happening here. You know, the rest of Florida's maybe not as extreme as we are, but, you know, and on one note of how these things are done, there was we had a period of what was called growth management, or wise growth, when the whole state was kind of lined up to manage what was then just a few tens of thousands of people coming into the state every year. And that state structure that would support the local structure has pretty much disappeared. So this is not, I think this is a time when all of that has to be rebuilt from the ground up, from very local involvements, and focus on the small things that can be done to once again kind of build up the groundswell through all the new people who are in the region or in the state, to make that, to rebuild that structure, that civic structure. You know, and I should say, maybe this is a positive note, that civic structure produces civic leaders. People like Neeson Kasdan, starting out in the Miami Design Preservation League, you know, as a volunteer, eventually becoming a leading mayor, that those are important. That's an important breeding ground, or place to grow good civic and political leadership.
But circling back to where I started, right, the 1983 and the sort of the good old dark days, and fast forwarding to now, we also, while all that is of course true, just the 2 places that I know best, where I spend my time, Coconut Grove and Coral Gables, have gotten so much better in a lot of ways. Now, underlying this, of course, is a relentless gentrification. There's no doubt. I mean, these are not places that are affordable to most people. But, you know, you have this kind of urban activity that you now see in downtown Coral Gables with the new restaurant row. You know, it's just fantastic fun to take visitors there. It's cafe tables in what used to be a pretty ugly little street. I'm talking about the Giralda Plaza, of course. Even Miracle Mile. You know, Coconut Grove, believe it or not, 5-6 years ago was being given up for dead. And now look at it. I mean, I'm talking about the commercial center, the village center of Coconut Grove. You know, I know locals don't go to South Beach, but you know, we also have to recognize the positive, you know, with all the problems, yes, that this place is really, in the old side, it's becoming a real city, as they used to say.
Yeah, and those places set examples for the new places that developers understand are needed, because not everybody can be in the places that you described. And so there are really great, wonderful success stories like downtown Doral, a recent remake of an office park into walkable community that has many different kinds of housing and kids walking to schools and so on. And so we just need to do more of that as well. And so these places are good, set the example for more great places.
Well, on behalf of the Princeton Club, thank you, Liz and Andres, for sharing your history and your thoughts with us. I think this is really a great discussion, particularly for those of us who are relatively new to Miami. And I'll close in reminding Princeton Club members that we have this upcoming pre-read discussion for November the 13th on a Sunday. You can come to Coral Gables at Joe Sorota's law firm, or we're going to do it on Zoom as well. So if you don't have a copy of that book, you can order it on Amazon, and watch your emails. We'll send out a reminder of this coming up. But again, thank you all for participating. I think this was a great discussion.
Thank you. It was fun.
Good. Good night.